Namaste, namaskaram, vanakkam, namo namaha. Continuing with the American Dream, Waking Up, Chapter 4, Blacks. This chapter is about slavery in America and religious beliefs behind this attitude. However, we must remember that slavery was not peculiar to America. Slavery existed for eons of time around the world, and it's not merely a racial issue. Blacks had black slaves, whites had white slaves, Polynesians had Polynesian slaves. However, the purpose of this book, The American Dream, Waking Up, is to look at the power of religious beliefs to do good and to do bad. And obviously we're focusing on Christianity, but we could apply this same wisdom to looking at the various religions of the world. However, one dream or illusion at a time. In this chapter 4, our sources of reference are the Encyclopedia Britannica, The Negro in American History, Slaves and Masters, Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett, Viking Penguin, 1984, The Black Book by A. Middleton, Random House, 1974. Chapter 4. As the wheels of progress continued to spin in America, it became clear to the sugar, tobacco, and cotton entrepreneurs that a labor force was needed to bring in these cash crops. The indentured system was developed in the late 1500s, and at first many blacks and whites, men and women, came from Europe to America to work the plantations for a specific length of time. After their indentured period was over, they would be free men and free women. The early American businessmen were not particular at first about who performed this necessarily arduous labor. At first, Native Americans were put to work, but they often ran away and defied capture. Poor white men and women were also employed, but probably because of their whiteness, there was some feeling of uneasiness about putting them to what amounted to slave labor. However, black men and women were different. They could not easily escape and hide like the Indians. They were strong, and they could be purchased far more cheaply than the white servants. And the obvious difference in skin color made them ideally suited, in the eyes of many whites, to perform this menial labor. Therefore, with the increasing demand for sugar and tobacco, the colonial entrepreneurs looked to Africa to provide them with an unlimited and cheap labor pool. Of course, there had to be some justification for simply sending boats to Africa and loading up with human cargo to be transported across the oceans and sold to the highest bidder. This justification was found in the Christian Bible. Quote, "Both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them ye buy bondmen and bondsmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall be your possessions." Leviticus 25, 44, 45. End quote. And again in Psalms 2, 8, 9, the, quote, godly, unquote, are reminded that the heathen are to be possessed. Indeed, the entire earth, making sure not to spare the rod for the unruly. Chapter 4 of Genesis marked the black person for life. As the governor of South Carolina, George McDuffie, proclaimed to the South Carolina legislature in 1835, quote, "For the institution of domestic slavery, we hold ourselves responsible only to God. No human institution, in my opinion, is more manifestly consistent with the will of God under both Jewish and Christian dispensations. Of our religion, domestic slavery existed with the unequivocal sanction of its prophets, its apostles, and finally its great author. It is marked on the face, stamped on the skin, and evinced by the intellectual inferiority and natural improvidence of this race. They have all of the qualities that fit them for slaves, and not one of those that would fit them to be freemen. The capacity to enjoy freedom is an attribute not to be communicated by human power. It is an endowment of God, and one of the rarest which it has pleased His inscrutable wisdom to bestow upon the nations of the earth. It is conferred as the reward of merit, and only upon those who are qualified to enjoy it. Until the Ethiopian can change his skin, it will be in vain to attempt by any human power to make free men of those whom God has doomed to be slaves by all of their attributes. To do so, one might as well remonstrate with the God of wisdom for having put the mark of Cain and the curse of Ham upon the African race instead of the European. End quote. Professor Thomas R. Dew, professor of political economy at William and Mary College, published the following in 1853, quote, "The children of Israel themselves were slaveholders, and were not condemned for it. All the patriarchs themselves were slaveholders. Abraham had more than 300. Isaac had a great store of them, and even the patient and meek Job himself had a very great household." Dew went on to say, "Servants are even commanded in the Scriptures to be faithful and obedient to unkind masters. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only toward the good and the gentle, but to the forward." 1 Peter 2:18. Dew continues, "These and many other passages in the New Testament most convincingly prove that slavery in the Roman world was nowhere charged as a fault or crime upon the holder, and everywhere is the most complicit obedience enjoined." End quote. The Reverend Dr. Richard Furman, representing the South Carolina Baptists in 1882, wrote a letter to the governor which included the following quote, "The right of holding slaves is clearly established in the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example." End quote. It was this kind of blind belief and lack of spiritual maturity, actually, that caused many of the whites to fail to recognize their own backwardness, and instead they saw heathens and savages in both the Native Americans and the black race. However, history records otherwise. French explorer Henri Lhote wrote, "Peoples of a Negro type were painting men and women with a beautiful and sensitive realism before 3000 BCE, and were perhaps the originators of naturalistic human portraits." End quote. There is archaeological evidence that blacks were among the first to use tools, cultivate, and participate in religious worship. The early blacks of Ethiopia were praised by classical writers such as Pliny, Diodorus, and Homer. Flora Louisa Lugard wrote, quote, "The Mosaic records allude to them frequently, but while they are described as the most powerful, the most just, and the most beautiful of the human race, they are constantly spoken of as black, and there seems to be no other conclusion to be drawn than that at that remote period of history the leading race of the Western world was a black race." End quote. In the Sudan, the powerful empires of Songhai, Mali, and Ghana rose in the Middle Ages. They were powerful, thriving societies with established governments, courts, armies, and prosperous trade relations. Basil Davidson wrote, quote, "It would be interesting to know what the Normans might have thought of Ghana. Anglo-Saxon England could easily have seemed a poor and lowly place beside it. End quote. In the 14th century, Mali, an Arab traveler, reported, quote, "Of all people, the blacks are those who most detest injustice. Their sultan never forgives anyone who has been guilty of it." End quote. During the 15th and 16th century, Timbuktu in Ghana was considered a great intellectual center noted for its scholars. And thus it appears that the early Africans had a venerable culture with complex language skills and deep religious roots. As a side note, so sad in many ways that the blacks assumed the religion of their slave masters. By the 17th century, in the seemingly inevitable cycle of the rise and fall of any culture, the great cultures of Africa began to erode. The Muslims were the first to capitalize on this disintegration by exploiting the Africans and capturing slaves. The Muslims were followed by the Portuguese, the French, Spanish, and English. The white nations fought for economic control as well as for control of the slave trade, even naming sections of the African coast after the major export, i.e., the grain coast, the ivory coast, the gold coast, and the slave coast. European slave merchants scoured Africa to buy and capture slaves. The slaves were chained together and forced to march, sometimes hundreds of miles to the coast. In some instances, black slaves were sold by other black men, and in others, slaves were taken as a result of war or simply kidnapped. The Europeans established forts along the African coast and held the captives there until they were ready for shipment. John Barbat, a trader, described the scene, quote, "They are put into a booth or prison built for that purpose, near the beach, all of them together, and when the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought out into a large plain, where the surgeons examine every part of every one of them to the smallest member, men and women, being all stark naked. These being so set aside, each of the others which have passed as good is marked on the breast with a red-hot iron, imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. In this particular care is taken that the women, as the tenderest, be not burnt too hard." End quote. The slaves, chained 2 by 2, were then rowed out to the awaiting boats. This human cargo was then packed so tightly together that there was barely room to move. At times there were scarcely 2 feet between decks, and the air was intolerable. A bishop, who was generally on hand to bestow his, quote, "blessings," unquote, on the captives, as they started out on their journey in boats named Jesus, Angel, and Grace of God, owned by Sir John Hawkins under license with the authority of Queen Elizabeth. There seemed to be no incongruity at this time between being a Christian and being a slave owner. For example, Captain John Newton continued studying for the ministry as he piloted his ship full of human cargo across the Atlantic, and he was vigilant in holding prayer service twice daily on board ship. Amazing grace indeed. Those of you may know that he is the author of this popular song today, Amazing Grace. Wow. Slaves were shipped from Africa to various ports, to Spanish colonies in South and Central America, to the Caribbean islands, and to America. Wherever the slaves went, a cruel fate awaited them. However, the Protestant colonies were looked on as the most hellish, as the Puritans came down hard on the African culture, religion, and way of life. The journey. The 10-week journey to America was a grueling ordeal, as Gustavus Vasa, a.k.a. Olaudah Equiano, excuse the pronunciation, a black youth, noted in his journal, quote, "When I looked around the ship, too, and saw a large furnace of copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted my fate. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. I wished for my last friend, death, to relieve me, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the others flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to water, I naturally feared that element. I would have jumped over the side. I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. Happily, perhaps for myself, I was soon reduced so low here that it was thought necessary to keep me almost always on deck, and from my extreme youth I was not put in fetters. One day they had taken a number of fishes, and when they had killed and satisfied themselves with as many as they thought fit, to our astonishment, those of us who were on deck, rather than give any of them to us to eat, as we expected, they tossed the remaining fish into the sea. Although we begged and prayed for some as well as we could, but in vain. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful, and heightened my apprehension and my opinion of the cruelty of the whites." End quote. During these insufferable voyages, many of the slaves died from disease, starvation, suffocation, and madness. So many dead men, women, and children were thrown all overboard from these ships that sharks followed behind many of the vessels all the way to the shores of America. Many of the women killed their babies and children to save them from further anguish. Buying and selling. When the survivors of the gruesome ordeal reached American ports, the slaves were sold openly in stores, taverns, and the village square. Finally, members that had survived the passage together were frequently sold to different buyers. With cold detachment, the white masters separated these loved ones indefinitely. The frightened captives were then subjected to further psychological ordeals that lasted from 1 to several years. Similar to the colonist treatment of the Native Americans, i.e., cutting their hair, giving them new names, and ridiculing their culture and beliefs, the black slaves went through a period of intense indoctrination. They were given new names, taught a simple English, and how to pray in the Christian tradition. During this period of controlled indoctrination, 3 out of every 10 died. It is no wonder that such a people, being so dejected right from the start, continually suffered from an identity crisis and lack of self-esteem. It was a heinous sin, oddly enough, perpetuated by the Christian faith and the founding fathers. Quote, In 1754, George Washington bought a male slave for $260. 10 years later, he paid $285. End quote. Religious justification. William Harper, who was endorsed by Senator John C. Calhoun in his Memoir on Slavery, 1837, stated, quote, "It is the order of nature and of God that the being of superior faculties and knowledge, and therefore superior power, should control and dispose of those who are inferior. The African slave trade has given, and will give, the boon of existence to millions and millions in our country who would otherwise never have enjoyed it. Or if for the rights of man over inferior animals, we are to refer to Revelation, which pronounces, quote, 'Ye shall have dominion over the beasts of the field and over the fowl of the air,' Genesis 1:28. We refer to the same which declares, not the less explicitly, both the bondman and the bondmaid which thou shalt have shall be of the heathen that are among you. Of them shall you buy bondmen and bondmaids. Leviticus 25:44. End quote. In speaking out against those who opposed slavery, Harper went on to declare, quote, "Do they not blaspheme the providence of God, who denounce as wickedness and outrage that which is rendered indispensable to his purposes in the government of the world?" Harper then equates the, quote, "fact," unquote, that blacks are simply ordained by God to be inferior, with a similar biblical fate for women. He goes on to say, "Females are human and rational beings, yet who complains of the order of society by which they are excluded?" Harper continues his attack, this time including Native Americans. Was the white race bound to leave this wide and fertile continent to a few roving and ignorant barbarians? Savage and civilized men cannot live together, and the savage can be tamed only by being enslaved, end quote. There was a problem, however. Now that the slaves had their souls cleansed, quote unquote, and the Christian had done their duty by bringing enlightenment, quote unquote, to the heathen, could they not now be considered as equal to whites? A Virginia law passed in 1667 quickly alleviated any misgivings on this matter. Quote, "The conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom," end quote. After this legal decree, the rest was easy. Successive laws followed that took away any hope of justice and equal treatment for basically anyone who was not white, male, or Christian. Massachusetts was the first colony to give statutory recognition to slavery. Then Connecticut, Virginia, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Slaves and Native Americans were not considered to be fully human according to the early Constitution, and therefore they could not vote. Of course, women were also included in this exclusion. They could not sit on juries. In fact, the word Christian used to be a dialectical way of distinguishing one from the lower animals. Therefore, it was easy to see how many were programmed to believe that all non-Christians were also non-humans. Each state had their own particular slave codes, which put the black person under the domination of every white. For example, a Mississippi court ruled that to rape a black woman was not a crime. It was a crime, however, to teach blacks to read. When Margaret Douglas was arrested in 1853 for attempting to educate blacks, Judge Richard Baker from Virginia declared that should the Negro be taught to read, especially the anti-slavery literature, it might induce them to cut our throats, end quote. Judge Baker went on to explain that the Negro could still be instructed, quote, with gratifying success, unquote, in the Christian faith, without also being taught to read the Bible. He declared, quote, their mere residence among a Christian people has wrought a great and happy change in their condition. They have been raised from the night of heathenism to the light of Christianity, and thousands of them have been brought to a saving knowledge of the gospel, so blessed by the elevating influence of civilization and Christianity, end quote. Let us look at this, quote, elevating influence, unquote. A Virginia slave law in 1668 declared, quote, if any slave resists his master, and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be accounted as a felony, end quote. Runaways upon capture were commonly branded with an R on their cheek. By the end of the 1700s, it looked like slavery might come to an end, but with the invention of the cotton gin, King Cotton demanded many more loyal subjects. Life on the plantation was carefully dictated by the totalitarian masters. Children were usually put to work by age 6 with simple tasks until they were strong enough, about age 12, to put in a full day in the fields. Meager food was doled out weekly and clothes rationed twice a year. The slaves generally lived in rickety cabins and often in large barracks. There were field slaves and there were house slaves, and there were the drivers who made sure that the work was done under the threat of severe lashings with the whip. Slave breeding was common. Quote, a slave woman is commonly esteemed least for her laboring qualities, most for those qualities of which give value to a brood mare. A breeding woman is worth from 1/6 to 1/4 more than one that does not breed, end quote. Under the domination of their Christian persecutors, there were those such as David Walker Brown, a Boston Negro, who spoke out. In his famous speech in 1829, Brown referred to the Negro's condition as, quote, our wretchedness on consequence of slavery, our wretchedness on consequence of ignorance, our wretchedness in consequence of the preachers of the religion of Jesus Christ, and our wretchedness in consequence of the colonization plan, end quote. Charlotte Fortine, the child of a distinguished Negro family from Philadelphia, and who was an active abolitionist, wrote in her journal in 1854, quote, Mr. Barnes, one of the most prominent of the Philadelphia clergy, who does not profess to be an abolitionist, has declared his belief that the American church is a bulwark of slavery. With what scorn must that government be regarded which cowardly assembles thousands of soldiers to satisfy the demands of slaveholders, to deprive of his freedom a man created in God's own image, whose sole offense is the color of his skin. And if resistance is offered to this outrage, these soldiers are to shoot down American citizens without mercy, and this by the express order of a government which proudly boasts of being the freest in the world. How can I be a Christian when so many, in common with myself, for no crime, suffer so cruelly, so unjustly? How long, oh, how long must we continue to suffer, to endure? End quote. There were also courageous white abolitionists who also questioned the motives of the church. One of these staunch abolitionists who saw through the hypocrisy of the Christian church at that time was Stephen F. Foster. In Foster's The Brotherhood of Thieves, 1843, he writes, quote, in exposing the deep and fathomless abominations of those, quote, pious, unquote, thieves who gain their livelihood by preaching sermons and stealing babies, I am not at liberty to yield to any intimidation. Nor should the friends of freedom be alarmed at the consequences of this faithful dealing with, quote, spiritual wickedness in high places, unquote. The church, slavery, and the mob are a queer trinity, and yet that they are. They are agreeing in one. This cannot be denied. Every assault which we have made upon the bloody slave system has been promptly met and repelled by the church, which is herself the claimant of several 100,000 slaves. I said at your meeting, the Anti-Slavery Convention held in Massachusetts in 1843, among other things, that the American church and clergy as a body were thieves, adulterers, man-stealers, pirates, and murderers, and that the Methodist Episcopal Church was more corrupt than any house of ill fame in the city of New York, that the Southern ministers of that body were desirous of perpetuating slavery for the purpose of supplying themselves with concubines from among its hapless victims, and that many of our clergymen were guilty of enormities that would disgrace an Algerian pirate. After being heckled and had eggs hurled at him, Foster responded, "Truly, the church is becoming terrible as an army with banners. This violence and outrage on the part of the church were no doubt committed to the glory of God and the honor of the religion, although the connection between rotten eggs and holiness is not very obvious. It is, I suppose, one of the mysteries of religion which laymen cannot understand without the aid of the clergy, and I therefore suggest that the pulpit make it a subject of Sunday discourse." Foster ends his discourse, "Thousands of the ministers and tens of thousands of the members of the different sects are actual claimants of slaves. They buy and sell, mortgage and lease their own brethren in the Lord, quote unquote, not infrequently breaking up entire families and scattering their bleeding fragments over all the land," end quote. In Foster's book, he also included quotes from prominent ministers from various denominations of that era. Reverend Samuel Houston of the Methodist Episcopal Church of Utica, New York, said, quote, "I should think nearly half at least of the ministers of our church hold slaves and trade in them," end quote. The Reverend James Smiley, a Presbyterian clergyman from Mississippi, wrote in 1838, quote, "If slavery be a sin, and advertising and apprehending slaves with a view to restore them to their masters is a direct violation of the divine law, and if the buying, selling, or holding of a slave for the sake of gain is a heinous sin and scandal, then verily 3/4 of all the Episcopal, Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterians in 11 states of the Union are one with the devil," end quote. In a pastoral message delivered at the annual General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the bishops concluded, quote, "We have come to the conclusion that the only safe, scriptural, and prudent way for us, both as ministers and people, to take is wholly to refrain from this agitating subject," end quote. In reply to this proclamation, Foster wrote, quote, "What could a conclave of demons in hell have said more? They see black women driven to prostitution. Marriage was not a recognized institution for blacks. Yet they have no wish or intention to interfere. They see men shackled and chained, and yet they have no wish or intention to interfere. They see babies taken from their mother's arms, and yet they have no wish to interfere." End quote. The Reverend E.D. Simmons, professor at Macon College, quote, "These extracts from Holy Writ unequivocally assert the right of propertying, owning slaves," end quote. The Reverend Thomas Witherspoon, quote, "The principle of holding the heathen in bondage is recognized by God," unquote. The Reverend Moses Stewart, professor of Andover Theological Seminary, quote, "The precepts of the New Testament, Ephesians 6:5, beyond all question, recognize the existence of slavery," end quote. James G. Burney, a colleague of Foster's, published The American Churches, the Bulwark of American Slavery in 1843. Addressing the London World Anti-Slavery Conference, he stated, quote, "The extent to which most of the churches in America are involved in the guilt of supporting the slave system is known to but few in this country, England," end quote. The Salem Observer reported the following in 1869. It was estimated that Southern churches and church members owned 600,000 slaves, Methodists 219,000, Baptists 125,000, Reformed Baptists 101,000, Presbyterians 77,000, Episcopalians 85,000, and other denominations 5,000. Speaking out. The Niagara Movement, which eventually merged into the NAACP, spoke out against the Christian church's condescending attitudes towards the Negro. In an annual meeting in Buffalo, New York in July of 1905, they issued a declaration of principles, part of which said, quote, "Especially are we surprised and astonished at the recent attitude of the Church of Christ, of an increase of a desire to bow to racial prejudice, to narrow the bonds of human brotherhood, and to segregate black men in some outer sanctuary. This is wrong, unchristian, and disgraceful to the 20th century civilization," end quote. In a letter addressed to President McKinley in 1899 by the Colored National League of Massachusetts, quote, "We have suffered, sir. God knows how much we have suffered since your ascension to office at the hands of a country professing to be Christian, but which is not Christian, from the hate and violence of a people claiming to be civilized, but who are not civilized. And you have seen our sufferings, witnessed from your high place our awful wrongs and miseries, and yet you have at no time and on no occasion opened your lips on our behalf. Why?" End quote. Richard Allen, a pioneer in the black church movement, recalls, quote, "The new black communicants were denied full status in the Episcopal Church and were barred from annual conferences and governing boards," end quote. Further discrimination. The discrimination seemed to be everywhere and unabashed. As the Mormon Church stated, quote, "Blacks can be members of the Mormon Church, but they cannot become priests, nor do they go to Mormon heaven," end quote. In the infamous Dred Scott case in 1857, Chief Justice Taney stated, quote, "They had for more than a century before been regarded as being an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made. The opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in moral as well as in politics, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to debate. And men in every grade and position in society daily and habitually acted upon it in their private pursuits, as well as in the matters of public concern, without doubting for a moment that this was the correctness of the opinion." End quote. A headline in the Charleston News and Observer in 1874 read, quote, "We must render this a white man's government," end quote. By the 1860s, with the Civil War raging, it became clear that the Negro now was a thorn to be gotten rid of. President Lincoln, in 1862, called for a voluntary colonization plan for Negroes to move to Central America. Lincoln stated, quote, "But even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. Therefore, it is better for both, therefore, to be separated," end quote. How many know this part of Lincoln? However, under obvious opposition to this plan, Lincoln later recanted and late in that same year began drafting his famous Emancipation Proclamation because, as Lincoln put it, quote, "We have about played our last card and must change our tactic or lose the game," end quote. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which finally gave the Negro citizenship, but not before President Andrew Johnson tried to veto the bill a month before. Free at last? By the 1900s, now that the Negroes were, quote, free, unquote, many whites, feeling threatened, instituted what came to be known as Jim Crow laws, after the mythical figure poking fun at the Negro lifestyle. The Christian belief in biblical absolutes certainly had a great deal to do with the sharp divisions between blacks and whites. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1890, marked the beginning of, quote, separate but equal, end quote. From that time on, for nearly 60 years, there were white and black restrooms, drinking fountains, restaurants, theaters, libraries, and, quote, public, unquote, parks. White women especially could not teach blacks, nor could white nurses treat black patients. There were white and black textbooks, and there were black Bibles for Negro witnesses, and on and on and on. It was obvious that the intention was to keep the blacks ignorant, which was evident in the 1930s when, on average, Southern states spent $49 for every white student and $17 for every black student. During much of the early 1900s, there were no black high schools. Now that the Negro was no longer useful, many whites felt it was time to be rid of this menace. Ben Tillman, one of the leaders of the South Carolina Constitutional Convention in 1800, reflected this attitude, quote, "We have done our level best," he said. "We have scratched our heads to find out how we could eliminate the last of them. We stuffed the ballot boxes, we shot them, we're not ashamed," end quote. Though many today are appalled at this sordid past and legacy of violence against another human being, it is incredible to still observe many who wonder at best why many blacks in America continue to live in terrible conditions, naively touting that the blacks have been, quote, given every opportunity, end quote. Many of these who are quick to point a finger have little or no conception of the suffering, psychological as well as physical, that many whites have in the past, up to the present, inflicted on many blacks and other minorities. When we look at violent outbreaks, such as those that occurred recently in Los Angeles, remember this book is 1993, but we could say the same thing today. We are witnessing the release of stress caused by continual oppression, injustice, and bigotry that many refuse to face as a reality. This denial and inability to relate to the natural law of cause and effect is often exemplified in the naive proclamation made by many whites that, quote, "this country was built by the whites," end quote. Such blind people totally miss the obvious colored labor force without which little growth would have ever taken place. It is cause for concern that there are many in the religious world and otherwise that continue in their ignorance to preach exclusivity against basically all who are not white and or Christian, emulating perhaps the sentiments expressed in 1926 by Imperial Wizard Hiram Evan in presenting the convictions of the KKK, quote, The fundamentals of our thought are convictions, not mere opinions. We know that they are right, in the same sense that a good Christian knows that he has been saved and that Christ lives. These convictions are no more to be argued about than is our love for our children. We are merely willing to state them for the enlightenment and conversion of others. They are condensed into the Klan slogan, Native, White, Protestant Supremacy, end quote. And isn't it incredible that so many blacks joined these Christian churches? Or the sentiments expressed by the Knights of the White Camellia, an organization in the 1860s closely paralleling the KKK. Quote, "It then became our solemn duty as white men to resist strenuously and persistently those attempts against our natural and constitutional rights, and to do everything in our power in order to maintain in this republic the supremacy of the Caucasian race, and restrain the black or African race to that condition of social and political inferiority for which God has destined it. Not to do this would be an invasion of the sacred prerogatives vouchsafed to us by the Constitution, and a violation of the laws established by God himself," end quote. As a member of the white race, and most importantly the human race, the author feels that, in a way, many should be thankful that those backward members of the white race at least chose to pick on, which is what a coward looks for, apparently such an inherently kind and spiritual people as the black and Native American races seem to be. Otherwise, the violence in America today might seem inconsequential. Unfortunately, presently, one can witness this same biblical bigotry developed by many whites against those of any color reversed. The movement of the black Israelites, for example, recognizes the injustices of the past and seeks to violently pay back the white race. They openly use the discriminatory and violent passages in the Bible, claiming that God is not only racist, but in this case, black. Therefore, in their eyes, it is time for the whites to reap what they have sowed. A vengeful God can be used by any side, depending upon the interpretation. The author feels that if God is portrayed as being violent and racist, regardless of whose side he is on, then the ultimate goal of life becomes violence and exclusion. Even if one race were to obliterate the other, the violent and exclusive theology would have to surface within that group as well, as statistics demonstrate that the majority of crimes committed against a race are often committed by those within the same racial group. Human beings, black, white, brown, red, yellow, or any mix thereof, cannot change the color of their skin, only the color or tone of their minds. If this God then is portrayed as love and inclusive, then such superficialities as skin color, culture, religious preference, etc. would mean little. Again, the problem is with the Anglo-Saxon term God, which is defined as a one male creator being. During the author's varied life encounters, he has felt blessed to become very close with many people from many races, cultures, and religions. And one can say from experience and with conviction the old cliche, people are people. It's really true. Universally, there are good and the not so good in all races, cultures, and religions. Superficial appearances do not necessarily indicate what lies within each of us. To those who have been wrong, please, let there be continual forgiveness. One can only conclude that perpetrators of these injustices have not only been dreaming a perverted American dream, but have been suffering from and have inflicted on others, as well as themselves, painful nightmares. This brings us to the end of Chapter 4. Stay tuned for Chapter 5 and see what was done to women in general.